Hey guys, today we're doing tactics for masters. So if you ever dreamed of becoming a master, this video is for you. So in this game we have an endgame and black wants to get a new queen by promoting his pawn on a1. And we not only want to prevent black from doing so, we actually want to win this game with the white pieces. Now let's pause the video and think of some minutes about how white can actually manage to do that. Well, the correct first move for white is to move rook to c2. I think it's also the most obvious one, and now black has two ideas to play. King b1 or king b3. What does white play after move king b1? Well, of course, a1 is still a threat, but we cannot really prevent black from doing so. We could play something like rook a2 takes and king c2, king a1, but we cannot checkmate our opponent because we would have to manage to get our knight to b3 next move, and that's simply not possible. Something like knight to e2, a2. Now we would have to play something like knight to b3, but it's not possible to do so because it's just too far away. So the idea rook a2 is not going to work, but we still have a knight. How could we play it? Well, the correct move in this position is to play knight e2, and if a1 queen, then we can simply give a check, and now black is actually in a very bad position because his king has simply no way to escape, and the only way that black can prevent from being checkmated is by sacrificing his queen on c3. Now what's the right move to follow by white? Correct, it's king takes c3. And after a2 we have one final move that we have to play in order to win the game. What is it? Well, definitely it's not king b3. Because after king b3 we can simply play move a1, queen as black, and you might say something like, oh, I can play rook h2 and checkmate our opponent and he has no checks. Well, this is only partly true, because queen to a8 can prevent white from doing so, and now black has actually winning position. So king b3 is the wrong move here, but the only move that actually wins the game for white is to move rook to b2. Now black again has two options, king a1 or king c1. King c1 is kind of obvious. White is just simply going to take the pawn and will checkmate in a few moves. And after king a1, now the king is actually trapped and in front of the pawn. So we won actually a move over here, and if we just go to h2 now, black cannot play a1 and promote his pawn to a queen, but has to go out of the corner again, and now we can simply checkmate black and win the game. So just to summarize this idea of king b1 again, after king b1 we play knight to e2, and after a1 queen we can play knight c3, exchange, after a2 the very important move rook to b2, after king a1 we can just go with our rook to h2 and win the next move. Well, that wasn't the full tactic, because we have to look at king b3 also, because now the king is not trapped on the first line anymore, but we are also threatening to play a1 and getting a new queen, so white has to be careful as well. What does white play in this line? Well, the correct move is going to be rook c1, preventing black from playing a1. Of course, the king is going to go back to b2. Now we're not going back with our rook to c2 and getting a repetition, but we enhance our position with king d2. And now we help our knight because we make space for it. King d2 does not only protect the rook, but also helps to play knight to d3 in the next move. So after a1, having a new queen, knight d3 is going to follow, king a2 to protect the queen, and knight to b4. Now, what comes after king b2? The following line is really going to be crazy. So it's just taking on a1, and now you might wonder, how can we actually checkmate our opponent? Well, in this position, it's just made in 2 moves. And the first move white is going to play is king c1. Now, if you see correctly, then you see that black has no king move, so he has to play a2. And now his king is trapped in the corner, so knight to c2 is going to be a checkmate. That's kind of crazy. Well, but that wasn't the full line, because there's still one thing we have to consider, and that is not playing king b2, but a1. This doesn't look logical in the first side, but after rook a1, king b2 is going to follow, and now he tries to save some time and push his second a pawn forward. Now, of course, we have to move our rook here to f1, and a2 is going to be black's idea. Now again, what do you think? What is white's idea to win out of this position? The only way on how to do so is to play king c4, making again space for the knight on d3. Now after a1, we again give a check, and after king a2, knight to b4, king b2, and rook f1, and now you see the importance of the king on c4, protecting the square b3 and preventing black from playing king b3, king a4. So black's king has to retreat on the b1 or c1 square, so on the first line, and now we can play something like king b3, and you see how important it is that we played earlier on rook f1 instead of something like rook g1 or rook h1, because now the knight on b4 is protecting a6, so black's queen cannot defend f1 anymore, and white can simply play rook f1 in the next move. Now, if our rook was on g2, black could have played in this position queen to h7, and if the rook was on h2, black could have played the queen a8 move and would have prevented checkmate in 1, but with our rook on f2, he cannot prevent rook f1 in the next move, and therefore is going to be checkmated. And if rook king c1 in this position, then white is having a different strategy, and this is going to be what? Correct, it's knight to a2. Now that looks kind of silly, but after king b1, king b3, and we're again trapping our opponent in the corner, and rook f1 is going to follow in the next move. And after king d1, rook f1 again is going to win the queen on a1, and that's going to be a win for sure in the next moves. So just to sum up this very first endgame, because that was kind of complicated, the first move is rook c1. After king b1, we play knight to e2, a1, and knight c3, and we're going to win. And after king b3, we're going to play rook c1. After king b2, king d2 to make space for the knight to d3. Now we're going to exchange and play king c1, a very important move to play knight to c2 in the next one. And the last idea, to play a1, now king b2, and rook f1 is the only move to win this position, and after a2, the second only move is king c4, making space for the knight to d3 again, and afterwards playing knight b4 and rook f2, followed by the move king to b3. And now checkmate is not preventable anymore. Now if you like this, then you also gonna like the second tactics for today. In this position, white is going to win, and only with his pawns on the queen side. How can white actually manage to do that? That's a question you should answer, so think about your next move and pause the video. Now, what are moves that white could possibly play? Something like a5, something like b6, c7, d7, maybe something like king to g4. Now, let's start with a move like pawn to c7. Afterwards, black is going to play c7. Now let's start with a move like pawn to c7. Afterwards, black is going to play rook f4, attacking the pawn on a4. And if a5 follows, then rook f5, and he attacks both the pawns on the queen side and the pawn h5. So something like b6 is not the best strategy because of rook h5 with a check, and afterwards rook takes a5, and now you see that white's pawns are totally harmless. Something like b7 is not going to work because the king can simply take, and now after d7, king c7, and black is going to win. So move c7 is probably not the best in the first move. Well, d7 is not getting any better because king d8 is the move that follows. Not playing king c7, of course, because b6 is coming with a check, and black cannot take one of these pawns because d8 and promotion of the pawn. So king d8 would be the only move, and now b7, king c7, and white would actually be able to get a pawn through and get a new queen. So king c7 earlier in this position is a bad move. So king d8 is the only move to play. And now let's say something like b6. And white's idea is, of course, to just go b7, b8 and get a new queen. But black can get a passive defense. And if white just says, well, I'm not going to walk with the b pawn, I'm going to walk with the a pawn now, black can go with the king around the pawns and attack the c6 pawn from the outside. And after a6, king d6, and you see that black is going to be a little bit faster and take the pawns from the sideline. Maybe something like b7, and king c6 is also going to win. So in this game, in this position, you would probably also think about d8, rook takes, and c7, but this is also not going to be a winning idea, because now the king goes very normal to the pawns and to c8, and the rook is going to defend after all the a file, and at the same time preventing the white king from getting across the fourth row. So there's no way that white can actually win this game. King e3 maybe, king b7, and if king to d3, then he's just going to wait, and there's nothing that white can actually do to win this game. There's no way that white can actually improve his position because black can just check from behind. So after all, b7 is also not going to be a winning move in this position. So let's look at b6. Now we have these 3 pawns, and both b7 and d7 is a possible way to threaten the black king. Now let's say king, rook to f3 and king to h2. Why not playing something like king to g4? Well, afterwards, rook a3, and now we're attacking the a4 pawn, but also threatening to check white. So getting a tempo, d7, king d8, d7, and now black can take the pawn with a check and get back ready in time to b4. And as we had it earlier, this is now very hard to win because of the move rook b6, and if white takes the pawn on h6, then we're having a very okay position because we take c6 with a check, win d7 with a check, and afterwards the rook can exchange for the h-pawn, and black can just get the b-pawn with his king. So this position would be a draw, so not the best result for white, but still better than losing. But we can improve the game if we don't play king g4, but king h2. So not getting a check when the rook takes the a-pawn, and therefore winning a tempo. Rook b3, check, and playing b7 now. And this game is a little different because in earlier games, the b pawn was alone, so there was no a pawn that could run like now, but that pawn was taken, so there was no potential for white anymore. But this time the a pawn can just run, and if black plays something like rook a3, we can immediately break through on the b file. So that is going to be a winning thing because black cannot leave his b line, and he has no moves at all that he can do to enhance his position, and now he's just simply going to lose. Even checks are no harm at all for white because he can just run to the front and there's nothing that can actually happen. And this game is going to be easily winning. Alright, so what was the right move again in the first position? Well, it was the move b6 because b6 has every option for white and doesn't lose any options, as we have seen with d7, for example. And after rook f3, it's important to play the king back to the second row because then we don't get a check when taking the pawn on a4. And now we really have a great position, and this position is very good because we occupy the king and the rook of black so that there is no breakthrough on the b or d file, and then our a-pawn can just simply run. Alright, if you have understood both these tactics, you're ready to become a master. Hope to see you in the next few videos. Bye bye.